All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to Bringing the Collective Together, Non-Human Animals, Humans in Practice at the University. My name is Laura Genera. I'm in the Political Science Department at UBC. Thank you, Green College, for believing in our idea to have this series and enabling it to come to fruition. This series exists because many people have invested their good hearts and good minds to create a space for a challenging conversation across scholarly disciplines. First and foremost are the students who have authored this project, and today it is them who I would like to name. First, the political science graduate student, Afsoon Afsahi, Afsoon of great spirit and energy. Please stand. And the UBC undergraduates, some of whom are scattered around the world right now, waiting to watch this on YouTube, and I would like to name them: Elon Cohen, Viara Gioriva, Christina Cook, and Lucas Pinero. And the undergraduate student authors who are here, who I'd also like to have stand: Darren Chang, Delana Heiberg, who actually has not come into the room yet, I don't think, Manjit Parhar, Shirin Shushtarian, and Caitlin Wood. These are imaginative, ethical, careful, searching, intelligent people, and they show what undergraduates can contribute to the ethical and intellectual life of our community, and I'm very honored to work with them. The questions we are asking are not invented by us. They hang in the air. How are non-human animals seen by humans and used by humans at the university in research and in teaching? What is the history of this practice? What are the ethics of this practice? How should a democratic society deliberate about the use of animals at the university? Does the prevailing mode of regulation reflect the value of practical wisdom? How might animal voices best be heard and attended to by an ethical democratic public? These questions challenge us across scholarly disciplines. I myself am located in the humanities and social sciences. Anthropocentric to the core, we have neglected the realities of non-human life in democratic society, or at least most of us have, not all of us. We invite the collective together then because we need each other. None of us is expert in everything that is at stake, and there's a great deal at stake. Here we are, human and non-human animals at UBC. Here we are on Musqueam land. A member of the Musqueam Nation and an environmentalist, Mr. Woody Sparrow, will now address us.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thanks to you all for coming. And I'd like to thank you to the traditional Musqueam land of where we are today. I'm a young lad. I'm only 43 years old. I'm not an elder. So I will be rather short with what I'm allowed to say traditionally. One, I'd like to welcome you all here to our lands. This is where we have been in this particular area for the last 4,000 years. And as you go further upriver, our sites get older and older because we're people who relied a lot on the animals that lived along the river and lived in the river and in the ocean as well. So when we talk about ethics of the animals that are used in science today, well, it goes back thousands of years for all of our cultures. We've used animals for clothing, we've used it for housing, we've used it for tools, but it's a respectful manner in which we First Nations are trying to pass on to the future generations and current generations. When I go hunting, I ask the deer to take itself and to give itself to me for my family use, my traditional use, and my community use. And only then, when I feel that the animals that acknowledge me, do I take its life. And when I do take its life, I ask for its thanks. And I appreciate it giving its life to me. And why do I say its thanks? Because it's part of life. So it's one of those weird concepts of understanding what ethics are. Culturally, they're all different. Our human needs are all different. So I'm hoping that from this gathering that we have here, that we can share some of those ethics and get to a central core of understanding where the animals' rights really exist, who speaks for them, and maybe we can give some more respect to the animals. I just came from a conference in downtown Vancouver. We're losing about 1/3 of the animals that we have in this area already. So we might want to think about that when we start to use animals for scientific purposes, and for medical purposes, and for general purposes. So we keep all those things in mind. That these things, to me, they all have spirit. I was brought up to understand that they all have spirit, and that spirit just like we have. And I'm hoping that the scientists can also understand that as well, because sometimes they remove themselves from that. I'm hoping that we can come to the understanding that we're all one, that we all live on this small rock. So I'm hoping that we can all share that. Whatever we learn here, we can share it around the world. That's all I have to say. And I'd just like to thank you for allowing me to be here. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura, for the very energetic and inclusive way that you've organized this series of lectures and events. Thank you, Mr. Sparrow, and thank you all for the honor that you've given us by being here today. I'm David Fraser in the UBC Animal Welfare Program. It's my pleasure to moderate as much as moderation is possible in today's event. First of all, I want to introduce our speaker, Rod Preece. Rod is Emeritus Professor in the Political Science Department at Wilfrid Laurier University, but I think better described as a historian of political thought. He's also a great friend of the University of British Columbia, of the UBC Animal Welfare Program, and of the UBC Press. And we're delighted that, in addition to speaking today, this is the book launch for Rod's new book. Just very briefly, Rod, in his earlier life, made some very distinguished contributions to political thought on somewhat more conventional subjects like Edmund Burke and the Anglo-Saxon conservative tradition, and then decided about 20 years ago to devote his immense powers of scholarship to the history of human thought about animals. It would be very tempting for me to list off the book titles and the other accomplishments that have flowed from this amazing effort, but I'm going to tell a personal story instead. The very first time I stayed here at Green College, I had a free weekend. And the good folks at UBC Press, realizing what a difficult situation this would be for me, handed me a stack of manuscript paper that became this book, Animals and Nature, Cultural Myths, Cultural Realities to Review. Well, the book was a breath of fresh air. I had been growing increasingly frustrated with the superficial quality of scholarship about human thought about animals in the humanities over the years. Here, instead, was someone who actually did the research, who actually studied the sources, saw them in their historical context, and was skeptical of the superficial generalizations, no matter how often they had been repeated by others in their own writing. Now, a word of warning. It isn't always easy to keep up with Rod. The forest that he describes is sometimes a large and confusing place, especially when other writers have caused you to expect a few well-manicured potted plants. But if you really want to understand the history of human thought about animals in all its richness and diversity and contradictions, then this is the source where you come to. It's a great pleasure to have Rod here with us today.
Well, thank you very much, David. I think I'll leave now. At least I better take my glasses with me. Now, the focus of this series, this thematic series, which is to be held over several months, is, in my view, one of the most important moral and practical questions of our time. All those who've helped to organise this are to be thanked deeply for giving it voice, and especially for giving it voice in such a beautiful place as Green College. Now, rather than following the customary path of investigating current manifestations of ethical principles, I propose to look instead today to the origins of ethics in order to see what light those origins may shed on the justification for the use of animals for human purposes. My esteemed friend Jodey Castricano will look to the current manifestation shortly. Animal ethics, I shall be arguing, are continually informed by the unwarranted assumptions of their origins. The Irish historian William Lecky wrote in 1869, and I quote, "There is such a thing as a natural history of morals." He was arguing that the benevolent affections from which our ethics are derived have expanded in Western cultural history from application to family, then to tribe, then to nation, then to class, then to humanity as a whole, and then to animals. So with increasing societal complexity, our loyalties become diffuse and indeed fraught with conflict for the interests of at least some of the groups to which we feel a level of attachment will be irreconcilable. It's not then that there is merely a natural history of morals, there are also different dimensions of loyalty which come to exist over time alongside the others. And the human-animal relationship is one of the most fraught with conflict. The very existence of an ethical sense arises from the benevolent and malevolent emotions directed toward those we are for and those we're against. They arise from the protection of and protection by those to whom we have the most immediate relationship, spouses, parents, siblings, offspring. They're then extended to the tribe. I'm not talking about what are called tribes today, because they're usually quite massive units, more like nations than tribes, and even though sometimes called tribes, they're not, they're nations. The tribe is usually about 120 strong. No larger than that, because at 120 they split off. So this primary organization is involved in mutual protection and the fulfillment of the social needs of its members. And it's in this way that loyalty to a body toward which our benevolent sentiments and our duties are directed arise in this way. We come then to feel obligated to a body which protects communal interests against those from outside. Sometimes other humans from outside the tribe with competing interests for scarce resources, but also frequently predatory animals. For as the bone fossil evidence indicates overwhelmingly, hominids were decidedly a prey rather than a predator species, and as Homo sapiens has been most of the time since the species' appearance about 200,000 years ago. All those outside the tribe, human and animal alike, are other. That is, they are those to whom the benevolent affections are rarely, if ever, extended. But then things change. Two antithetical relationships between human and animals began some 10 or so thousand years ago. On the one hand, the wolf, or its near descendant, from whom all dogs are descended, became a helpmeet in the hunt, and thus gradually became a peripheral member of the human tribal community. And so there was a positive relationship toward the animal. But on the other hand, and contemporaneously, those societies that became agricultural rather than remaining solely hunter-gatherer began to domesticate and breed relatively compliant species as a living larder and walking wardrobe, a permanently renewable source of food and raiment, not as a consequence of human ingenuity, but as a response to climate change and increasing scarcity of traditionally hunted species. So it was hunger and want rather than the moral and intellectual superiority of humans that drove the inception of agriculture. And it was in large part in this that Western society alienated itself from the animal realm. As conquered species, the domesticated food animals were treated with disdain by their masters, just as the Normans treated the Saxons in Britain from the 11th century on, as did conquerors in a myriad other cases, more as the norm than the exception in human history. And these oppressions reflect two relevant and significant facts. First, that control of and disregard for the interests of fellow animals was not at all restricted to the human-animal nexus, but was a part of human behaviour toward fellow beings generally. Secondly, the legitimacy of what amounted to enslavement of fellow humans and fellow animals was accepted by the conquerors as a part of the natural order of things, simply an essential part of the way of the world. If might did not make right, at a time when there was as yet no language of ethics, might was accepted as the natural source of practice. So the winners not only write history, but they also write the ethical rules, which are in most instances accepted by the vanquished as well as the victors. So the human conquerors determined the ethical rules even before there was ethical discourse. Traditionally, the origins of philosophy are said to lie with Thales in the 8th century BC. But it was not until the 4th century BC that ethical discourse was said to have been introduced by Socrates. Now, as Cicero explained, Socrates was the first, and I quote, to call philosophy down from the heavens and set her in the cities of men and bring her into their homes and compel her to ask questions about life and morality and things good and evil. So it's first with Socrates that we get an explicit recognition of matters ethical, and it is with Socrates that we get the first purported justification for the use of animals for human ends. It was Xenophon, contemporary associate of Socrates, who stated Socrates' position, because, as is well known, Socrates never put stylus to parchment for posterity. So, having made the bold assertion, which he neither examines further nor explains, but merely assumes, he says, "The beasts are born and bred for man's sake." No evidence, just taking it for granted. Beasts are born and bred for man's sake. He then stated what he claimed to be Socrates' views, that human uniqueness consists in the possession of hands, speech, erect posture, awareness of the deities, the capacity to anticipate, the enjoyment of learning, and the possession of sexual appetite unbroken to old age. In fact, Xenophon was expressing nothing more than the superiority humans had come to feel as a result of their dominance of animals through agriculture. It functioned more as a justification for their habits than as a description of human superiority. The salient point is that Xenophon did not offer any justification that animals may be used for human ends, nor did Aristotle when he elaborated the point a little later. And it's this original, unexamined assumption of superiority which remains the core in all subsequent discussion. Human superiority over animals, and with all its attendant rights, is so much taken for granted today, and in fact it's almost unthinkable to question it. But if we look at it historically, no good grounds were ever given why it should be so, or at least no good grounds were given in its origins. But if animals lack some of the attributes of humans, it would be no difficult matter to categorize the attributes of animals that humans do not possess or possess in less exalted degree. Immediately to mind come the echolocation of bats and whales, butterfly migration, the echolocation, the capacity for unaided flight of the birds, the nimbleness of the mountain goat, or the direction finding of the honeyguy, all attributes which humans cannot match. But are these attributes not as impressive as human attributes when we consider their role in furthering animal goals as the beings that they are, with the needs, wants, and purposes they have? Certainly, some of the categories Xenophon mentions are very impressive. Humans possess hands with opposable thumbs, which permit manual dexterity in a manner alien to other species. But then we must ask, of what benefit would the possession of opposable thumbs be in the fulfillment of their needs as the animals they are? Would opposable thumbs be of any value to whales? Any more than, say, hibernation would be to us? And speech is certainly an impressive faculty, though it's dependent on the possession of the FOXP2 gene, not because of human ingenuity. However impressive the faculty of speech may be, Thomas Hobbes pointed out memorably in the 17th century that a primary purpose of speech is to deceive, to lie. Now, it's not that other species do not lie. They lead predators away from their young by pretending they are elsewhere. The difference is that we lie more persuasively than others. So is being persuasive liars the mark of our essential superiority on which to predicate our rights over the animals and to use them for our own ends? Now, the question is, of course, rhetorical. I'm not suggesting that the negative aspects of our attributes are the only aspects, but I am suggesting that they deserve earnest consideration in any scale of nature we may wish to devise. And it is the idea of a scale of nature, with humans at the apex of animal being, which lies behind the human belief in its rights to use other species to its own ends. Despite my reservations, what is important about Xenophon's statement is that in having called ethical philosophy down from the heavens, there was an acknowledgement that the human use of animals required a justification. It had been an implicit, if unexamined matter, for several centuries in pre-Socratic Greece. When an animal was to be sacrificed to propitiate the gods, it was deemed necessary that the victim should acquiesce in the sacrifice. Well, of course, the acquiescence was obtained fraudulently. The sacrificial animal was anointed with liquid, and when the animal moved its head up and down to rid itself of the annoying intrusion, then acquiescence was assumed. But the principle persisted nonetheless, even if it was merely a lingering and ineffective principle born of the need for self-justification. But the practice appears to suggest that at some prior time there had been an unresolved musing whether humans had any rights over the lives of animals. Well, by the time of Xenophon, human superiority had, well, with rare exceptions and a few misgivings, been taken for granted for some millennia. It hadn't always been so. In earlier times, in the struggle for life, the procurement of food and shelter had not favoured the human species. But it now became the norm to accept human superiority and entitlement to greater moral consideration on its account, and to tease out the criteria which entitled humans to that consideration. The earliest Homo sapiens would have found the idea preposterous. Indeed, the human species was so unsuccessful as an animal that it came very close to extinction 80,000 years ago. It was so unsuccessful in the struggle for life that it simply could not compete with other animals. In other words, esteemed human attributes were totally ineffective. Speech and the like didn't matter at all. So in teasing out these criteria of superiority, we've been offered in the course of Western history reason, speech, a religious sense, anticipation of future goods and ills, opposable thumbs, upright stance, being alone in God's image, the possession of an immortal soul, the possession of a moral conscience, and primacy in the phylogenetic scale, all shouting human superiority and hence rights over other species. But again, with no real justification. So a more formalized stage of humanity's precedence over the animals was that of Plotinus in the 3rd century AD. He devised what became known as the Great Chain of Being, which became one of the most important presuppositions of Western thought, remaining the predominant conception of relative human-animal status until the end of the 19th century, being treated not merely as an evaluation of relative merit, but as a scale of undeniable fact, and it has remained, at least implicitly, the mode of consciousness prevalent until today. We simply assume that humans are superior beings. Now, the chain of being posited God at the summit, followed by the angels, then humans, then the higher than the lower animals, plants and minerals in descending order. The criterion of relative status was the possession of reason. The model proved so persuasive that as late as 1893, William Minto, professor of logic at the University of Aberdeen, said that it was a product of rigorous and indisputable logic rather than a convenient yet controversial assumption about supportive of human dominion over the animals. In fact, as I've intimated, its origin lay more in human self-indulgence than in science. That reason should be the relevant criterion of merit had remained the unquestioned assumption throughout the period of the sovereignty of the chain, and remains so today in the popular and even the scientific mind. The poet Alexander Pope was a rare dissenting voice in history when he averred in the 18th century, and I quote, that man has reason enough only to know what is necessary for him to know. And dogs have just that too. Greater reason, he implied, would have been of no benefit to dogs. Once the great chain of being had become the intellectual norm, reason, always capitalized, was the undisputed category which was considered ground for conferring on humans preferential rights over animals, and indeed often enough to give the latter little serious consideration at all. Yet there are certain downsides to reason, the most important of which is that reason is undeniably the source of our desecration of the environment. If exalted reason has provided many human benefits, it has also produced the greatest devastation, from weapons of mass destruction to all those ills that put the very survival of the planet and its inhabitants at grave risk. A persuasive case can be made that reason has been the most destructive faculty in the course of our planet's history. So reason certainly has no undisputed claim to allow humans preferential consideration. We may infer that reason was chosen as the reigning criterion of entitlement to preferential consideration for no better reason than that it was the faculty which seemed most important in assisting humans to fulfill their ends, regardless of whether it was a faculty of equal or even substantial importance in helping other animals achieve their ends. Animal attributes would appear to be at least no less successful in furthering the fulfillment of the animal's ends with the wants, needs and purposes they possess than human attributes in fulfilling human ends. What I've implied is that there are no adequate and certainly no unassailable grounds on which human rights and needs trump animal rights and needs. But of course, such a conclusion does not for a moment accord with the reality of our cultural beliefs. Invasive animal experimentation is condoned as a necessary evil. And that's the context in which the use of animals for human purposes must be discussed if any advances are to be won. But where do we begin? Well, in accord with Aristotle, there would appear no reasonable alternative but to start with how relevant persons do think and to work from there. But it's a far from happy starting point. For it is to begin from the context that human rights and needs are entitled to greater consideration than animal rights and needs. The conclusion is preordained by the premise. Yet, at the same time, we must recognise with Edmund Burke that, yes, I brought in Edmund Burke again, I was bound to do that, that what may be morally right may be politically wrong. The demand for wholesale rethinking may hinder piecemeal improvement. To achieve some measure of progress in practical matters, moral compromises will almost always be necessary. It's inadequate to argue that the current practices are unjust. If we believe they are unjust, we're still constrained to accept them for what they are and work within the context of current mores. But we should also note that it hasn't always been so. A belief favourable to animal experimentation is not a reflection of a perennial norm. Animal experimentation as such was in fact abominated by the great literary figures from Shakespeare to Samuel Johnson to Bernard Shaw and to many others. It was only in the 20th century that support for animal experimentation became the norm. Despite the temporary influence of Descartes and later Pavlov, both of whom treated animals as machines, throughout Western cultural history there has been a belief among those dwelt on the matter in the centrality of sentience and the centrality of not causing harm. Beginning at least with the Jewish Torah, it has been held by Theophrastus, Maimonides, Rousseau, Bentham, etc., that animal suffering should be avoided wherever possible, although of course harm to animals was less important than harm to humans. It has then been a common presumption throughout recorded Western history, but certainly not a well-practiced one, that we have a responsibility not to cause and a duty to prevent suffering to animals. But oddly, that's where the problem begins. If we have a duty not to harm animals, but at the same time have the possibility of improving human life by harming animals, then ethics becomes a precarious juggling act, balancing conflicting rights and duties. And while I've argued that humans have no incontrovertible rights over animals, we have no alternative but to accept that for the present, almost all who legislate, all who are involved in ethical review committees, all of those who conduct invasive experiments do think we possess those rights. What prevails in such committees is a view which is called reasonable partiality, implying that equality and universality are admirable principles, but there are occasions when it's appropriate to deviate from them. In the field of invasive research on animals, that amounts to the adage that it is wrong in principle to harm animals where no offsetting benefit is achieved, but where considerable benefits to humans may be reasonably confident of achievement, the experiment is justified. I'm not saying the experiment's justified, I'm saying that's the general belief. and that is indeed the preponderant belief in Western culture. This generally proclaimed practice reflects on the surface the principle enunciated by the scientists Russell and Birch over half a century ago, when they introduced the 3 R's program of replace, reduce, and refine. The problem is today that mere lip service is paid to the principle. Very little attention is devoted to alternatives. Efforts at reduction have been a total failure, in part for legal protection against being sued, rather than because the research is likely to produce benefits. The task of ethics review committees appears analogous with one of the tasks of government in education policy. That is, to diminish the effects of the partiality of parents toward their own children. In other words, to represent the disadvantaged. The committee, however, see their role as an impartial one. Yet in the current cultural context, to be impartial is to be partial to the researchers. In effect, the committees represent the interests of the researchers, sharing by and large the same belief system with them and believing in the virtue of so-called reasonable partiality. Only egregious ethical breaches are curtailed. In reality, the committee represent the interest of those already advantaged rather than the disadvantaged. If reasonable partiality appears so reasonable to most, there are still important questions to be asked. If it's reasonable to favour human interests over animal interests in some circumstances, and most believe it is, would it not be equally reasonable to discriminate in some instances in favour of whites over blacks, heterosexuals over homosexuals, and Christians over Muslims? Well, presumably the answer to that question is no, it would not be. If there is any case to be made in favour of reasonable partiality in such cases, it is usually thought appropriate to favour those who have been traditionally disadvantaged rather than advantaged, i.e. to level the playing field. But the very opposite is true in the case of animals. We discriminate in favour of the already advantaged against the already disadvantaged. In animal experimentation, reasonable partiality in favour of human interests can only be warranted if we declare humankind more worthy. Yet it's a most daunting task to seek criteria which would allow the task to be accomplished and invasive research to be justified. The traditional concepts of Western cultural history, such as reason and speech and opposable thumbs, are less than wholly persuasive. And we're left with the rights of sentience, avoidance from harm, and the value of life itself as the primary considerations. Unless we can find some convincing means of justifying the valuation of humans more highly than other animals, we must have the most serious qualms about what we do in invasive animal experimentation, however beneficial the projected ends. At the very least, this implies that animals as the objects of research are entitled to a great deal more consideration than they commonly receive. To conclude then, either the human is an animal in precisely the same way that other animals are animal and subject to similar considerations, or if we are to seek a justification for our invasion of animal bodies, we must resort to regarding the human as a quasi-divine existence. And I hope that most of us would consider that rather unlikely. The human would have to be designated as a minor deity. And in effect, that is what has really happened in Western cultural history. But even then, it would be a vivid stretch of the imagination to portray humanity as a benevolent deity. The underlying norm, might makes right, however artfully disguised, has never disappeared from human ethical principles and practices with regard to animals. It's a formidable tradition with which to contend, but one very worthy of contending nonetheless. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Rod, for starting today and starting the series of events in such a spectacular manner. To no one's surprise, perhaps, an extremely scholarly analysis, drawing on history, but bringing us up to the very real problems that we face today. So thank you again. I'd now like to introduce a second colleague who's going to speak before our discussion. It's a great pleasure to have with us Jodey Castricano. Jodey is one of our UBC colleagues, albeit stationed at the Okanagan campus rather than here. She was formerly a colleague of Rod's at Wilfrid Laurier University when she was in the English department there. Here she's a professor of critical studies. Jodey is the editor of a book called Animal Subjects, an Ethical Reader in a Post-Human World. She specializes in critical cultural theory, including animal studies and discrimination on the basis of species. It's a great pleasure to have her on our campus and enjoy her presence here today. Thank you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the introduction. There will be a second volume of Animal Subjects coming out at the end of 2012 with a new set of contributors. Firstly, I'd like to thank the collective for being the collective, for bringing this all together, especially so quickly. I mean, this has really been on our minds for about a year, and when I was approached by Laura, I thought I was going to be the only person in the world at UBC that was really concerned with animals, and the way that things turned out actually up in my own university, it did seem that that was going to be the case for a while, because I was charged with having a religion and just twisting the minds of the students, and I was anti-science and all kinds of things. And then I got a call from Laura, and it was just made my day. While I also want to acknowledge the fact that we are on Musqueam land, I want to thank also Rod, who was not only my colleague, but also really my mentor in this field. We used to go almost, I know, he says it just makes sense.
That to try to show how old I am.
Yeah, that's what he tells me. Right. Anyway, but we used to end up going to a vegetarian restaurant pretty well on a monthly basis there before he retired, and he actually made me understand that I could do this for a living as well as do the other work I did in the English department. I think our job, especially in the opening session here, is really to set the stage, to bring home to our sensibility the idea of the collective and what it means. It's also to bring about the thinking about what it means to talk about non-humans and the institution itself. That is often something that gets elided the actual animal when we're talking about the institution, because we have to talk about ourselves. We also have to talk about our ideas of the institution and the place of the animal within it. So what this paper, this much shorter paper, is going to do is give an idea of the effects of such thinking and tell us what might be behind the role of such thinking in our consideration of animals and how we perceive them amongst us. Because you'll note here, even as we sit talking, there really aren't any animals in here with us, other than the fact that we are animals ourselves. But granted, they're all still within those confines of which we speak, within the university itself. So as we speak of them, they live the lives that they do. In 1978, this is going to read more like a shorter academic paper, by the way. At the Modern Language Convention, critical theorist Monique Wittig startled her audience with the announcement that a lesbian is not a woman. As has been pointed out by feminist scholars such as Judith Butler, Wittig's aim was to critique the heteronormative category of sex, as well as the system of compulsory heterosexuality to which it is tethered. At the time, Wittig concluded, men and women, you can put those in quotation marks, are political categories and not natural facts. In effect, Wittig challenged the idea of woman as an essentialist concept by historicizing and thereby undoing the notion that women are a natural group. More recently, scientist and philosopher Donna Haraway advocated a feminism that does not embrace capital W woman, but is for women, and took things even further when she called into question what has been described as the presupposition of the human, in that the classical conception of a bounded human subject has become difficult to sustain in light of recent challenges to what counts as being human. Indeed, these recent challenges, we could say, take us to the water's edge regarding the human subject, as can be heard in a provocative question put to Haraway. When we have never been human, what is to be done? In fact, contemporary debates, what counts as being human, challenge us even further to radically rethink the concept of the social. For as Haraway declares, social relationships include non-humans as well as humans, even though we'd never know it. In other words, non-human beings called animals pose philosophical and ethical questions that go to the root not just of what we can think, but also of whom we think we are. In this regard, Haraway's questions resonate within feminism as well as within post-humanism, which is now a field of theories and critical practices out of which come further questions aimed at interrogating the borders of human exceptionalism. And I think that Rod has given us quite a long history of what constitutes human exceptionalism and where it's brought us, as well as critiquing the role played by speciesism in maintaining what critical theorist Carrie Wolf calls that fantasy figure called the human. That would be us. In line with these seismic interrogations, Bruce Maslish, in The Fourth Discontinuity, identifies 4 ruptures in the history of modernity, which in the names of Copernicus, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud have forced a rethinking of what it means to be human or not by substantively troubling the notion of human exceptionalism to the extent that the polarization of the human and non-human can no longer hold. In this paper, I follow Maslish, Derrida, Donovan, and Wolf in considering the significance of posthumanism. We're proposing to think about the animal or to consider it because it signals the emergence of a 5th discontinuity, one which not only troubles the concept of the human that the human falsely gives to itself to enable its recognition from a safe ontological distance, as it were, but also, and more significantly, does so because, as Carrie Wolf says, it binds us to non-human being in general and within that, to non-human animals as the very condition of possibility for what we know and for sharing it with one another. That's something that we're going to have to take into consideration over this time. It has to come to bear upon the actual animal. This is to say, this is a class without individuals. So it's to even to get it and to bring it down to the point of thinking of it at that stage. In this regard, however, the fifth discontinuity is yet to come, although it has already been. I say this because the conditions of its possibility take us to the limits of identity politics upon which much of the thinking about animals or considering them in institutions, including extending of rights, personhood, or moral consideration, has relied. The point I will be making is at least twofold. One fold takes the form of a question and leads directly into the posthumanist territory of the fifth discontinuity. How can we apply the rights of person to animals if the very distinction between animals and persons is inherent in the notion of rights? Kelly Oliver argues, for example, that there are problems using the same terms of identity to liberate when those same terms have been used to subordinate. In other words, she asks, what happens when the rights discourses, quote, either use or repeat identities that have historically been used to exploit certain groups, or it uses the value of the dominant group as its norm? On the other hand, the rights dilemma regarding the non-human being in general, and within that to non-human animals, can be resolved by adopting an ethos possibly predicated upon what Kelly Oliver has called a strange kinship, which can be seen as an ethical turn, based, as Oliver says, not on blood or on generation, but on a shared embodiment and the gestures, now get it here, of love and friendship among living creatures, made possible by bodies coexisting in a world in which we all depend. Environmentally and ethically, this also means realizing that the human-animal divide is also political and sets up the very possibility of politics. Thus, the notion of kinship, however strange, leads us to consider the interrelatedness of all forms of oppression based on the logic of domination and biopower, which functions socially, culturally, and politically through what Foucault calls the apparatus. That is that thing that keeps us all going here. And he calls it a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms. We talked about Green College. Regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral, and philanthropic propositions. In short, the said as much as the unsaid. Such are the elements of the apparatus. The apparatus itself is the system of relations that can be established between these elements. So as Stephen Tierman points out, the gloss on the apparatus amounts to a shift from the human to living beings, and thus helps us to begin to acknowledge that the experiences and subjectivities of other creatures may also be deeply shaped by the apparatuses within which they are situated. And that, of course, includes the university, as well as the zoo, the slaughterhouse, the rodeo, all of those things that can be considered part of the apparatus in motion. Biopower. The shift from the human to living beings also has the advantage of radicalizing epistemology in terms of love and friendship, in that such recasting, as Tierman observes, would allow us to expand imaginatively beyond the exclusively human realms of concerns, and we cleave to those most desperately. And this would therefore throw into radical question the schema of the human, upon which the issue of rights has traditionally and often paradoxically rebounded. In an interview with Elizabeth Roudanesco, Jacques Derrida expresses concern with the notion of extending rights to animals. Why would he do that? For as he points out, the concept of rights, of right and rights is part of a tradition whose conceptual system trades on excluding, exploiting, and disavowing animals or anyone seen to be like animals. You see it in the paper all the time. Oh, just like an animal. He or she was just like an animal. So we often talk about and use in a disproving way all forms of animalization. And that goes from as far as history is concerned, as far as slavery and rights discourse for women. As Derrida puts it, rights discourse has a way of reconfiguring hierarchies and subtly confirming a certain interpretation of the human subject, which has been instrumental in maintaining the oppositional and exclusionary limit between man and the animal. These reconfigurations are one reason why Derrida has grave concerns about extending right to some animals and not another. He mentions, for example, the Great Ape Project. To want absolutely to grant, not to animals, but to a certain category of animals, rights equivalent to human rights would be a disastrous contradiction. It would reproduce the philosophical and juridical machine thanks to which the exploitation of animal material for food, work, experimentation, etc. has been practiced, and tyrannically so, he says, so that it is done through an abuse of power. So as Kelly Oliver points out, what Derrida is worried about is that giving rights to some animals, but not all, would repeat the exclusionary logic of the Cartesian subject and the juridical conception of individuality and freedom resulting from it. And it's this logic which has justified and sustained the practice of exploitation of animals all along. And it just functions just beneath the surface of things. According to Oliver, the contradiction regarding rights, so-called rights, comes in when we realize not only that the history of rights is based on the ideals of autonomy, rationality, individuality, and sovereignty, which in part, one might argue, can be extended to animals, but also, and more significantly, that such ideas are already built on opposing them to animality and animal nature. So this is to say, as Derrida does, that to confer or to recognize rights for animals, that's animals, is a surreptitious or implicit way of confirming a certain interpretation of a human subject, which itself will have been the very lever of the worst violence carried out against non-human living beings. In this regard, the question of thinking about animals or bringing into contact the collective together is now to consider human animals and the practice within the university itself. And it's always interesting to me that it's the university that brings us all together to talk about it, but it's often at a time when there's been such controversy and debate that, in fact, the university can't ignore it any longer. And this, to me, also comes at a time in which I taught a course at which I had these same accusations leveled against me. And some of the students, there was 9 of them from the course, took it upon themselves to produce a journal that came out this summer, and it was called Regardless. And they worked on it all summer. They wanted support from the department, and they were told, in fact, that it was polemical, and so therefore shouldn't be actually supported unless it was kind of done under the table. But I mean, isn't that the point of the university itself? Should we not be discussing these things? Should we not be even a little bit offended sometimes, so that we can ask ourselves about why we are offended? So the question of thinking about animals becomes moot so too does it considering them. Unless we first come to terms with the epistemological structures that organize how we know, how our knowledge gets transmitted and accepted, and why and how it is received. Furthermore, it is to come to terms with those structures rather than content that reify the logic of domination. How, in other words, thinking about animals, even within the collective, may involve repeating and reinforcing the notion of the human subject built on the backs of animals. Furthermore, it becomes apparent that in the Newtonian Cartesian epistemological paradigm, the subjective as well as the affective are not only suspect, but also strongly repudiated because unscientific or irrational. I was also told, when you're running a religion, you're repeating the kind of terms when we're talking about creationism. So therefore, what I was doing in my classroom is irrational. So here we are with this irrationality. Strongly repudiated because unscientific or irrational, for as Brian Luke rightly observes, the term rational and irrational distinguish between positions worthy and unworthy of being heard. In this regard, it's telling that similar epistemological aporias regarding the reason-emotion divide appear within the discourse of animal rights and resonate with what Derrida has called the war on pity. Consider Tom Reagan's assertion that it's reason, not sentiment, not emotion, that is key in making the case for animal rights, since it's only by, quote, making a sustained commitment to rational inquiry instead of indulging our emotions or parading our sentiments can any progress be made. Josephine Donovan has also observed that Reagan, as well as Peter Singer's rejection of emotion and their concern about being branded sentimentalist, if not terrorist, are not accidental. Rather, they expose the inherent bias in contemporary animal rights theory towards rationalism, which paradoxically, in the form of Cartesian objectivism, established a major theoretical justification for such abuse. Moreover, Donovan contends it's unfortunate that contemporary animal rights theorists, in their reliance on theory that derives from the mechanistic premises of Enlightenment epistemology, that is, natural rights in the case of Reagan, and utilitarian calculation in the case of Singer, and in their suppression or denial of any emotional knowledge, continue to employ Cartesian or objectivist modes, even while they condemn the scientific practices enabled by them. So the point of such critiques, however, is not to invert the traditional hierarchy, to instead place emotion over reason, but rather to suggest that in ethics, reason and emotion work together, so that attempts to expunge emotion from theoretical ethics are artificial and self-defeating. One might argue that it's a critique of patriarchal metaethics that Kerry Wolf has in mind when he expresses concern over the problem of locating the animal in animal studies, saying just because we direct our attention to the study of non-human animals, and even if we do so with the aim of exposing how they have been misunderstood and exploited, this does not mean that we are not continuing to be humanist and therefore, by definition, anthropocentric. There's a book that's just come out, and it's yet another one of those books. It's all dedicated towards arguing for human supremacy, for human exceptionalism, and it has to do with the fact that humans have a recursive memory, whereas animals do not. And I mean, I guess the point of that is to say, well, so what? I mean, it just, as Rod has pointed out, we get to a point where what we see is that there's certain arguments that get used in order to justify just about anything. You treat anyone or anything as an object, and they can be used according to your will, and it's usually in terms of an abuse of power. This is to say, of course, that anthropocentrism relies upon the denial or suppression of emotional knowledge to sustain the rationalist framework of humanist or Enlightenment thought, even when a dualism of reason over emotion, as Brian Luke observes, makes so little sense theoretically. Thus, it remains to draw attention to the necessity of conceptual shifts in the questions that must be asked, especially over this series, because now it's out in the open, that must be asked of theoretical approaches to thinking about animals and their place within even talking about them in terms of the collective, and what sustains such thinking, not only at the symbolic level, but in terms of the singularity and embodiment of animals with regard to their suffering, as well as their joy, their pleasure, their fear, their family relations, etc. In other words, it might even mean to address how, in a certain way, thinking about animals might reiterate a figure familiar to us with regards to Cartesian ontology and epistemology. Namely, it is the figure of the thinker, the sovereign subject of anthropocentric thinking, the cogito ergo sum of patriarchal metaethics. Or to use Carrie Wolf's terms, it is the figure of the human who, imbued with individual consciousness, reiterates the anthropocentric subject-object divide in relation to the object of study, the animal. And of course, we all know how many objects there are. How many go through this university? From this position, Wolf maintains the human is at a safe ontological distance and is able to recognize the non-human other in a gesture of self-flattering benevolence, wholly characteristic of liberal humanism. So we also have to be very careful here about the kinds of questions we ask and where they lead us. In my view, the thinking of Derrida, Wolf, Oliver Donovan, and other post-humanist theorists carries the force of an epistemological aftershock delivered along the fault zones of human exceptionalism and anthropocentrism, where these have already been destabilized as a result of the 4 seismic events I mentioned earlier. If anything could be said to embody the 5th discontinuity, it is the question of animality, which, as Derrida contends, is difficult and enigmatic in itself because it presents the limit upon which all the great questions are formed and determined. Just think about that. This is to say that the 5th discontinuity involves a deconstructive accounting and an ethical turn. If such an accounting is to be possible, how can thinking about animals bring us not to the familiar threshold of the thinking subject, but offer us the opportunity to undermine that architecture in more radical ways, and therefore even render open the discussion of the institution that began in earnest too in the 19th century. We wouldn't even have the SPCA if there weren't people like you sitting around and filling halls and talking about these kind of issues. So I'm just about done here. To consider this opportunity, I shall now return to reflect briefly upon the condition of possibility with which I began this discussion, and which binds us to non-human being in general, and within that to non-human animals. It is, as Wolf remarks, a less visible bond between human and non-human animals, as beings who can not only live and die as embodied beings, but also communicate with each other in and through a second form of finitude that encompasses the human-animal difference, forming a bond that is all the more powerful because it is unthinking and in a fundamental way unthinkable. Here, of course, emerges the paradox of an unthinkable thinking about animals, which does not give itself to the human of humanism, but rather recalls at every turn the implications of a trans-species perspective that relies on a bidirectional inference, which, as Gay Bradshaw contends, charges us with a recreation of ethics, and I think you were alluding to that too, Rod, and reasons and ways of knowledge-making that reflects our understanding that animals are fully sentient beings. This recreation turns upon the fact that, as Derrida says, no one can deny the unprecedented proportions of the subjection of the animal. Meanwhile, it has become clear that over the last few decades, the force of evidence from neuroscience, ethology, and psychology has made it impossible to retain the idea that only humans have emotions, culture, and all the other attributes that are used to justify human privilege over other species. To live a trans-species episteme of knowledge-making and decision-making, therefore, has the potential, as Foucault might say, to shake up habitual ways of working and thinking, to dissipate conventional familiarities, to reevaluate rules, oh please, and institutions, starting from this re-problematization, just try and say it, to participate in the formation of a political will. This is not to be taken for granted, of course. Such a political will is based upon an ecological and eco-critical ethic of care, adopted by such thinkers as Derrida and Coetzee. Participation in its formation not only means an end to what Carol J. Adams has called the war on compassion, but also the understanding that because interrelated, we live on this planet not alone. Thank you.
Just remembering that this is one of a series of events, and that we will be coming closer toward the end to some of the practical questions, utility of animal research, how animal research should be governed, and so on. Thinking that today we have two very profound and intellectually historical presentations, I'd invite you especially to probe our speakers on the ideas that they've presented. There's a great deal of richness here, and I'd be very pleased to hear your thoughts and questions and probing of speakers on what they've said. Please.
Hi. I have a question for you, Rod, and one question for Jodey, so I'll just shoot them out. And then you didn't talk about Pythagoras, and so I wondered if you would perhaps do that for the audience, because I think that's so important in that history.
I didn't talk about.
Pythagoras.
Oh. Well, I don't think Pythagoras is really that important, in that.
I disagree, but go ahead.
Well, his views were very largely predicated on religious observance, on prayer, and there was no ethical message in it. I mean, there are so grave doubts about everything about Pythagoras. We don't know. We know very, very little indeed about Pythagoras. There have been a tremendous amount of people who've thought of themselves as Pythagoreans. And there was one Pythagorean who did come close to ethical discourse, and that was Empedocles. But since Pythagoras never put anything down himself, and since he was never ever clearly reported, and since so much of his cult was behind closed doors, I mean, there were very special kinds of places in which you could be according to whether you were at one level or another. There's even but actually Barnes, in his book on Greek philosophy, doubts that Pythagoras, well, in fact, says almost certainly that Pythagoras was not even a vegetarian. And it's very difficult to talk about Pythagoras because really almost nothing is known. A lot is thought of, though.
So my other question, and I'll just mention Paola Calavieri is someone that talks quite a bit about Pythagoras. But my other question is to Jodey, and that is when you talk about in this paper that you just read to us or just gave to us, much of it is about a post-humanist way of looking at this, and I wanted to sort of go back to Reagan particularly, who, my own thoughts, having thought about this a lot, is that it's really important not to throw that out, particularly Reagan. I'd like to throw out Singer at this point, but not Reagan. That Tom actually really does deal with the emotions in a lot of his writings, and certainly in the newer things as well. And also because it's really, I think that there are some aspects of posthumanism that are problematic when we're talking about particularly experimentation, particularly biotechnology. And I wondered if you had some thoughts about that. Haraway's somewhat
Good.
problematic.
Good.
And I know we've kind of talked about this, so maybe you would.
Thank you very much. Could I just intervene? I omitted to do one thing, is to say, please identify yourself. So, if you would, please.
I'm Carol Gigliotti, and I teach critical animal studies at Emily Carr University.
Ah.
And I'm the curator for the, I'm going to put a plug in, the Interactive Futures Animal Influence Show, which is coming up in November.
Thank you very much.
And show conference, we have Mark Beckoff coming, so.
Thank you very much.
We're part of this too, only we're at Emily Carr.
Of course. Thank you very
Okay,
much.
to answer your question, I
Yes.
don't think the point is to throw anybody out, because certainly the whole issue is historically relevant to us. I'm not sure what, other than, you know, your mention of Haraway, and she definitely seems to be, you know, going sideways somehow, or over to the dark side. But because I'm not really sure where she's coming from when, for example, she starts saying, for example, yes, what we do need are more animal experiments, and that she seems almost to be talking out of some other mouth that is formed on her face. I can't quite figure that out. But as far as posthumanism is concerned, I don't find it problematic, especially since what it's aimed at is, you know, to call into question all those kinds of, well, the apparatus, all those discourses,
Yeah.
all the institutions, and all of those things that normally we would have been expected to take as normal and natural, and even calling into question the category of the natural. So
Right.
I think once we start to call into question, especially that notion of human exceptionalism, then we're going to have to ask, you know, how did we get there? And I mean, in part, read Rod's book, but the other part would be certainly just to ask ourselves how we continue, even though we ask those kinds of questions. It always amazes me that we forget that we're doing the asking, and that we forget that we're doing the asking in terms of a form of privilege itself. So, you know, like here we are in our own institutions asking those comfortable questions and making ourselves feel quite good about asking them. But if that's where it stops, then that's a problem.
Good. Max, please.
My name is Max, excuse me, Cameron, and I'm in the Department of Political Science. I'm just troubled by the idea that the place to begin this conversation is by denying the moral significance of the distinction between non-human animals and human animals. And the reason I say that is that it seems to me counterproductive. I noticed that, you know, Rod, in your discussion, you make little, for example, of the of speech, human ability for speech, and you talk about humans as deceivers. And yet you could argue, and many have, that speech and indeed deception is the source of our sociability. It comes from our remarkable capacity to see others as having moral agency, of having intentional states. And it's on that foundation that we build notions of right and wrong, of rights and obligations. And surely, if we are to get our affairs in order, I mean, we are the species that is in a position to bring unbelievable stress to animals living on the planet, and even to their viability, and to the viability of the planet. Given that that's the case, it seems to me that surely the only way that we can get our affairs in order and to live in greater harmony with nature is by doing what we do as humans so exceptionally well. And that is precisely to speak, to communicate, to act together, and to assume responsibility. If the animal world had those abilities, surely we would see nature striking back at humans for the pain and horrors that we're inflicting on the planet. We don't see that. So we have to use our humans, our distinctly human properties, surely, to address these problems, rather than starting from something which actually does require that we be more like robots, which is to assume that we can make little of those distinctions.
Thank you, Max.
I agree with most of what you said, and I wasn't trying to suggest that humans shouldn't do what they do well. And I don't see why they shouldn't continue to do those things well. The point is that it simply isn't to give them moral precedence and give them greater rights on account of it. They're peculiarly human attributes, but so are their peculiarly whale attributes or monkey attributes. And it's best for them to go on doing what they do well. And we shouldn't interfere in their rights to do that. Unfortunately, though, since I'm going deaf in old age, I couldn't get much of what you said, so I'm sorry if I completely ignored it.
No, I think you got the gist of it, Rod, for sure.
Good.
Definitely. Yeah. Sir.
I'm Brian Vincent, Director of Stop UBC Animal Research. And my question is, it appears that society, at least I hope society, is moving in a direction of inclusiveness of animals and a more compassionate society, but at the same time, UBC as an institution seems very stuck in an archaic, utilitarian, anthropocentric view of animals. In fact, more animals are used in research than ever before, 100,000 animals a year at UBC, where monkeys are administered electroconvulsive shock with no anesthesia. The backs of cats are cut open and screws are put into their spines. Saline solution is poured down newborn piglets' throats. And UBC continues to try to justify this in this very anthropocentric, utilitarian way. My questions are twofold. One, why is UBC so stuck in clinging to this very archaic way of thinking? And two, how can we ever shift the view on this campus, an institution which claims to be quite enlightened, and yet doing these horrific things to animals with taxpayer money?
If I knew the answer to that question, I would be in great demand, be everywhere and do everything. No, I don't know how we get them to change their mind, to see things in a different way, other than constantly having events like this and to make these views the most commonly accepted and understood. I think the important thing is to change the culture. If we change the culture, even scientists will change with it. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think that if you think of the constant talking that has gone on over the, what would we say, the last 50 years, that it has begun already to make very significant differences. Not in terms of actually changing what scientists do yet, but certainly in terms of changing a significant number of people, especially young people, to think quite differently about the way they thought about those things before. And this generation will, of course, also become the new scientists. And I think many of them will have significantly different attitudes than they have now. Now, can we change things tomorrow? Not in my view. I don't think we ever can. I think we should be very happy if we can change things in half a century. But if we can change them fundamentally in half a century, I think that would be absolutely remarkably good.
Thank you, Rod. Jodey, did you wish to comment?
Actually, I just want to respond. I think, sorry, was your name? Max. That premise that nature is and animals are not striking back, I think, actually could be revisited, because there's plenty of documented evidence that, well, first of all, nature is striking back, and so too are animals. The other part of that, to address what Brian was saying, I absolutely agree with Rod. But we've seen it, the fact that we have been talking for centuries, not only about the human-animal divide, which I think it's important to question that, particularly because if you start even thinking about, oh, I don't know, let's say 1920, women weren't even persons then. And so we had that infamous persons case that took, women another 15 years to be even regarded as persons, to be even given the authority to work within a courtroom setting. So consequently, I think that what we have to do is, just to not, I don't know, I just want to say, just don't give up. Because what we're doing is at least and I think in part the media is very useful for those who want to see that kind of change, because the media actually gets out this information much more readily than it once did by letter or by those, by newspaper or something like that. But what we have before us, we've always had a new generation coming up, a new generation of scientists, a new generation of scholars, of thinkers, of those who were really concerned with what happened to animals. But I think today we are poised at a place that we haven't seen before.
Absolutely.
And I think that
20 odd years ago, when I changed from Edmund Burke to being interested in animal politics instead, all my colleagues thought I was absolutely crazy. And they were probably right, but that's a different matter. Today, they take it for granted it's a perfectly legitimate enterprise to be involved in. And that really is a very significant change in 20 years.
it is becoming more so, although you still, I think, run into institutional walls when when you might end up as a faculty person or even as a student sometimes feeling isolated, and it's really, I think it's just important that we continue to seek out other individuals or other organizations or other materials that we can bring to bear on these questions, because they're going to matter, folks. I think probably in about 50 years. It's we won't be here, but hey, well, most of you will. Some of us won't.
Just thank you very much. Just to add another comment from my own activities in the animal welfare initiatives of the World Organization for Animal Health. 2 years ago, we had a set of animal welfare standards for laboratory animal use proposed and adopted by 178 member countries of this international veterinary body. Now, I was very critical of what the standards said. I felt they didn't go nearly far enough and weren't nearly specific enough. But even 10 years ago, to have the 178 member nations agree to these standards at all, even consider them as part of this international process, would have been almost unimaginable. So I just want to second the idea that change seems glacial in its pace, but from a very long the viewpoint of very long lives, it's amazing what's happening. I had Rodri, please.
I'm Rodri Windsor-Liston. I'm actually on faculty, and I happen to be president of the BC Foundation for Non-Animal Research, and we support a lot of cell and tissue culture research, but we're well aware of the limitations. But I'd like to take you further. I'd like to get you to think about some of the fundamental questions we've got to rethink, including the nature of death and disease. Because the great push for the experimentation is the furious pursuit of the extension of life, often. Or on the other side, it's the cosmetic field.
Response?
I wonder if you could sort of take us to a point where we can make a solid return argument, as it were.
a solid return argument. I think
To
that.
get beyond where you've been, how are we going to really
I think
establish
the
a new platform?
non-human apparatuses that have been developed within laboratories are actually beginning to speak to that. And as awful as it sounds, even that notion of in vitro meat, which is some kind of, I don't know, jelly goo, or it's some kind of weird thing. It's, what's interesting is when you talk to people about that, they say, no, they could never eat that because there's something really creepy about it. And I think, well, that's really interesting, because what it's doing is sort of provoking that the affective response to that human-animal divide. But there's a couple of things about science that I think, for example, I can't remember his name, but he was the director of the National Institute of Health in the US, and he claimed science should not be hampered by moral considerations. And the idea that science is value-free is, I think, first of all, one of the things that has to go. And we start to recognize that whatever happens within laboratory conditions, on the one hand, is less even about animals than it is about big business. It's huge business, the cages, the food, all that kind of stuff. And so, we also have to start addressing those kinds of sources of of how the animals end up being used. I think the other part about that is we have to understand that, if we think that science is the arbiter of truth, and all the rest is superstition or kind of feminine whatever dribble, then then that's why we have to start asking those kinds of questions, because I think we can go beyond. We've already gone from 1980s to now using different kinds of cell culture and different kinds of experimentation.
Thank you, Jodey. I have failed in my instructions to wrap things up by 6 p.m., but I did, before noticing the time, nod to one person in the back, and so I want to ask for that question.
My name is Haley. I'm actually a student journalist here at UBC, so I'm going to ask you some questions kind of as a journalist, so don't take it personal. This has been an extremely academic discussion, and I have a couple of problems with that, so I'm going to try and frame them as two questions. And one is that, you've presented papers and they've been extremely academic and used a gazillion words I don't understand. And they're so far removed from normal people. How can you reconcile things like animal research helping diseases and things like that? And you say that, science should not be free of value, it should not be free of morals. So it's not. It's the value of, and the morals of human health. It's the people we personally care about. So, these very academic things are very nice, but they're very disconnected from.
Well,
yeah.
could I?
Okay, thank you very much. Who would like to respond?
I will quickly respond. I mean, even if you think about, the experiments that were done to produce the polio vaccine, they were 30 years behind the production of polio vaccines, where so many people died because they were relying on animal models, when in fact they could have been determining the vaccine from looking at human beings. The other one, that other famous one, is about insulin. Mm-hmm. And, there are three kinds of, I already said I was going to keep it short. I'm going to turn it over to Rob, because I'll just...
It's just that, you can say things like that, but they're just single anecdotal evidences. They don't explain the whole thing, They're just little pockets.
I don't think, firstly, anybody is ever going to explain the whole thing. I think
But I mean, there's no point in me saying an anecdote and you saying an anecdote. It doesn't solve anything, and that's my other problem with this very academic discussion. I'm not trying to be judgmental, but it seems that everyone in the room is all very happy and agreeing with each other. So is this panel going to have some other voices? There's no point in having this if there isn't a conversation, if we're just all agreeing with each other.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the critical issue that you raised is, how does this type of academic discussion inform and change things and relate to things that actually happen in practice. So we're living today, in this hour, in the world of words. How does the world of words relate to the world of actions? We've heard from Jodey. I would love to hear if Rod, who has walked this walk as the president of the Ontario SPCA, etc., would comment.
I think the way in which it affects action is that in talking to people who are already convinced that there is an appropriate path, that it gives them further encouragement that the path is there and many others also believe in it. It brings them into mutual action and generally changes the culture, which I think is ultimately the only way in which real change can ever be made about practical issues. I'm sorry, but I really can't hear you. That's not. I answered.
I thought the reason that this panel was brought to UBC is because there are specifically issues, there's the Stop UBC Animal Group, there are specific issues with UBC. So if you don't engage with those people at UBC, then the conversation here doesn't go any further. It just seems to me.
Good. Thanks, Rod. I think that's good.
Okay.
Thank you for that worthwhile challenge. I think that.
Quickly.
Okay.
We could talk more at dinner, but I think, this is just the beginning of all of the series itself. We could have had two speakers who radically disagree with each other. I think what we were just trying to do was set out some of the terms here, and I don't think it's just UBC either. I think it's a university culture itself that promulgates medical schools, animal testing units, all of that. There's big research money to be considered, and I think that what we're doing is, as Rod said, trying to, first of all, bring together those who have that kind of directionality to begin with. Where this goes out of here, that's part of the question that I was asking, is if we're just going to be talking about it, do we all just go away? What happens still to those animals that are still in the cages? Well, sometimes people get arrested, but it's calling into question those in authority who would like to frame those who care as being terrorists or being dangerous. And I mean, that stuff appears in the popular newspaper. What we're doing here is also trying to open it up within an academic setting, which doesn't usually happen. It usually happens actually out in the public. It's actually out in the public that there's more being done.
Good. Thank you very much. Folks, just to draw things to a close, I want to thank again Laura for the wonderful energy and inclusiveness that she put into devising this series, and I assure you this is the beginning of a series that will go from more foundational to more applied. We will have an event where we have people with some very different viewpoints. Thank you, Mr. Sparrow, for your introductory remarks. Thank you especially to both of our speakers for putting so much thought and effort into giving us a very good basis for the beginning of discussion. Thank you all for coming.